Welcome, everyone. Warm welcome to Anand Deshpande, the founder and chairman of Persistent Systems. Anand's not a stranger to the technology world at all. Most people would have probably dealt with or come in contact with some products that his company has built over the last 30 years in some shape or form. A specialist product engineering company is how they started off 30 years ago. And they have evolved into a true digital transformation player in the space of automation and many other areas. But the purpose of this session with Anand, where I also have my colleague Klaus Mortensen, who's a principal analyst with Ecosystem. He's based out of Denmark in Copenhagen. Klaus is also not new to technology. Klaus has been covering the emerging technology areas for over 10-15 years. One of the foremost analysts that I knew in my career in the analyst industry, who's covered that. So I think this is a really good mix of some brain power coming from two sides. But the session today is not going to be focused on automation and digital transformation and all the cool things that Persistent Systems gets associated with. This is more about Anand and his views. Anand is the chairman of the company. Anand also focuses a lot of his energy now on various humanitarian efforts. So we'd love to hear what role technology can play in the process of societal healing as we get through these difficult times. So, Anand, you're no stranger to helping out with efforts around supporting people in different ways and supporting communities in different ways. And you have been running quite a few philanthropic initiatives. I also read that Persistent Systems separately is also participating in supporting efforts around the fight against COVID. I read about that a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for that. But I wanted to get a sense from you on, I guess, what are the steps that you've been taking, or your foundation and your association in supporting and engaging in supporting the community at large?
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of context about what we do as part of this foundation. It is called the De Asra Foundation. So DE is for Deshpande and ASRA are the initials of the family members, my wife and two kids. And essentially it's a family foundation, and we have a mission to help individuals become self-employed or help the self-employed people. These are small businesses that run between 2 and 8 people. So they are really tiny. They are pretty much self-employed plus. And the problem is that these very small businesses have very limited support, both from government and other areas, and also in India specifically, the bureaucracy and the requirements for doing a whole bunch of things that they must do. It's very hard for them to do all of them and still run their business and have it running with 2-3 people. So what we have been doing is we have been identifying these 60-80 processes and templating them end to end and trying to make sure that these small businesses don't fail, but they can succeed. So this is what we do in a good day, and that's what we've been doing for the last 5 to 6 years. We have about 75,000 businesses that are in our network right now, and we've been growing quite rapidly before COVID. Now, all of a sudden you have COVID, and in India, at least from March 24th, we have been in sort of quarantine mode. Businesses have been shut down. Many of these small businesses that I work with, they are pretty much shut down at the moment. Unless you're doing essential food supplies, everyone else is shut down. So all these businesses are operating on a cash flow turnaround type business. So every business makes the money and turns it back into the business. So they are into these high turn, rapid turn kind of businesses. And when you have your cash flows out of action, that's sort of when you really don't have money to pay for it. They don't carry a whole lot of assets and cash in the bank for paying 6 months or 3 months. They're all operating in 15-20 days salary. So there is a huge issue right now where you have your 4 or 5 employees, you want to pay them salaries, you have to pay the March salary, you have to pay the April salary, rents are an issue. So there are some very difficult challenges on cash management and how do you help businesses to manage their cash better. So that's the problem statement. What are we doing about this? One, of course, is we are trying to help these businesses keep their morale up. We are helping them with trying to figure out ways to improve their cash flows, maybe potentially create some schemes to help them collect money from customers in advance, do some gift coupons or whatever else to see how to roll in cash right now. We've been also working with banks and other things to see how to help businesses, get the money they would need to get back to business. And the last thing, which is I think very important and relevant from what you guys have been talking about as well, is technology. Market when that comes back up, it's not going to be the same. If I have to run a beauty salon with social distancing, what does it really mean, right? So how do you use technology to maybe deal with some of these problems? How do you deploy some kind of electronic payments, electronic delivery of goods, queuing systems, a whole bunch of things that can be done to just simply run a business in this world. So we've been helping out and building out systems to make that happen. So it's been quite busy trying to work with these people, but it is very challenging for this group of people.
I agree. And Klaus, this is some of the areas you were talking about last week when we had our analyst session as well. In terms of
certainly you could say this time around the damage has been done in many cases. You certainly see a huge impact on sort of the small to medium enterprises throughout most sectors, but of course the worst hit are typically the hospitality sector, cafes and restaurants, hotels, travel certainly. But of course the especially in kind of countries with harsher quarantine restrictions or lockdown restrictions where most shops have been closed, everybody's suffering, but especially the smaller ones. But even the bigger ones we're seeing in the US, we're seeing some of the big department stores filing for bankruptcy. We see the same in the UK to some degree. This is certainly one of those crises that's weeding out the ones who were already in trouble before the crisis. And I don't really necessarily see them re-emerging after the crisis. Now, the problem we have now, of course, is what's going to happen if a new wave comes in. And that's where we're looking at increased readiness for a new wave. And it's certainly true that a lot of that is bank driven as well, because what we see throughout most of the world is that the banks haven't necessarily been ready to extend cash credits to smaller businesses, especially 1- and 2-person businesses. On the other hand, there is a need for it. So every society has to find that balance between what banks can and cannot do and what banks should and should not do. And obviously that sometimes has to be helped by governments and government credits extended to the banks. But yeah, the thing I think we're emerging with now is that we're all kind of dreading, if not expecting, a second wave at some point, or certainly that this will happen sometime in the future again. And the big issue now is just how can societies, how can different kinds of businesses become more ready to deal with the crisis next time over? And how can they put a technology-driven, typically, regime in place whereby they can have enough flexibility to keep as many of the jobs as they can as possible by shifting their business orientation towards something different throughout the crisis?
I'll look at it in two ways, and I'll address the first question. The ones that absolutely have to just pivot and rapidly adapt technology now to be able to cope with just the post-COVID scenario. And then the second, focus on the critical sectors that we need to look at from a humanitarian standpoint.
Well, certainly, if you look at the affected lines of business right now, it's typically the airlines. The airlines stand out because they're the ones who are hit completely from day one, no income and no income in sight. Even once this wave at least passes over, and even if there's medication and perhaps a vaccine coming, people's the travel restrictions will remain, or people will not want to travel in the same way as they did before for quite a while yet. So if you're an airline, you're looking at perhaps a year and a half, at least, before things somewhat normalize. And for them, they really have to figure out new ways of generating income that's not people driven, but perhaps something else. So all airlines, or most airlines, are shipping goods as well. And we still know that goods need to be shipped. So a typical operation for them would be to shift their focus away from people to goods. And not all airlines, however, are completely capable of doing that, at least not in terms of ramping up their cargo operations as much as they would. And then you have a bunch of other airlines who don't have any cargo operations at all. They might need to get into the cargo space if they want to survive through a crisis like this. So if we're looking at it from a healthcare perspective, I think we need to look at coming up with technologies that can help hospitals, healthcare staff to better do their jobs, even during a crisis with non-corona patients. Whether it's remote treatment, whether it's remote diagnostics, things like that, or remote training of medical staff, that is already there, it exists, but that really needs to be ramped up, and hospitals need to be ready for it.
Anand, are you seeing, I guess, realization in general from the industry and from governments that from a healthcare standpoint, they are going to have to need to use technology to have remote care, remote diagnostics, and treatment, as Klaus mentioned, because one of the biggest challenges is, one is finding the solution and vaccine for corona, but as Klaus pointed out, the fact that other ailments are getting neglected, and people might be getting more sick or dying because they're not getting the right treatment. And is that something that you're seeing at the moment?
I think telemedicine, again, is something that people are starting to look at in a very big way. So again, there are varieties of how far you want to go on that. So how many things do you want to ship to the patient at their home? How do they get the diagnostics to go along with it? How do you get maybe an MRI to happen from home, right? So there is a whole bunch of very different kinds of things that people are looking at, which would of course be slightly longer to medium term requirements, meaning it's not going to happen during this COVID problem. But as we say, that if it is possible to do some remote work, why not look at that? So there's a whole set of action that we see there in the US on that. We also work with a lot of instrument companies, people who make diagnostic kits and chromatography stuff, or spectrometry, or qPCR, and all of these kinds of equipment. So this whole diagnostics business is starting to become pretty big. So there is a clear understanding that we've seen ourselves being flat-footed in some ways. We all thought that we were all, especially the US context, we all thought that we would have this is a problem that should have been easily handled. But this has gone on for a while, and it's not looking like we are seeing the end of it. So that's the US point of view. On the India side, the things are quite different, actually. We have clearly a lot of confusion in terms of so this whole segregation of the sort of the lack of availability of the right kind of equipment, whether it's PPEs, masks, and all these other things. So this whole trying to separate the really sick from the not so sick, and then the ecosystem around all of this stuff in government hospitals, and a lot of the corona cases have been very diverse. Actually, there are certain areas where it started out by those who were traveling and who could potentially afford the treatment, to now it's gone into very densely populated, low-income housing areas. So there it's kind of very tricky to see how do you manage all of this stuff. So there has been a lot of, I guess we've been badly exposed in some ways. So everyone realizes that to get out of this, we have to, one, be a little bit more systematic. Second, invest a bit, and not just the short term, but also the long term. And technology is going to be the only savior in some sense, because there is no way, any other way you can get this to happen.
The way I see it, there are three critical areas I think governments and industry need to tackle together now and planning ahead, right? We've talked about the healthcare sector. I think that's immediate. We're already in the middle of it. In fact, almost all the efforts being put into this are around healthcare and treatment. But the second and third are also absolutely critical to societies. The second one is food. Given the risks around food sustainability, do you think the government needs to be thinking now, and not just in India, all governments need to be thinking now, how to deploy technology to address this issue of food sustainability?
So, yeah, I think this is clearly a problem. Food, as you pointed out, is a big issue in India. Water is another one of those related points where, we are dependent on the monsoon. So a lot of different planning needs to happen to make sure that there is food and water. And I think the biggest problem in India right now is around the supply chain. With the supply chain being completely stopped, transportation has been very difficult. Yes, people have started to now move trucks around, but that has been one issue. And also this is the season when some crops have to be managed and tilled. And so there's a lot of pressure on the sort of storage of food that has been there. Fruits and vegetables are kind of, at some places you have them in plenty, but they're not getting delivered to the right people at the right time because there is no way to get it around. So I think we have a huge issue in terms of trying to figure out how to make this whole system so better that, when it gets built or created and produced and processed and delivered, how do we use technology to ensure that we get a slightly uniform way of tracking and tracing and making this all happen? So there are a lot of different kinds of challenges that need to be thought through in the food context. Currently, I think everyone is so super busy on just trying to manage the COVID health related stuff that a lot of these things have the risk of getting ignored, and I think not enough R&D has happened yet. So I think next few years should be pretty important I think few right decisions in the next few years are necessary for, at least from the India context, to ensure that we are better prepared for the next kind of a situation like this.
Yeah. And there is a big role for technology in that, right, Klaus?
Well, there is. I do believe, though, that for now, in terms of, at least from a government perspective, it's more a planning issue, contingency planning issue than it is a technology issue. If you look at it from the food producers, then yes, then technology becomes more important. Automation, robots, etc. And you can see that a good example is the meat plants in the US, because they're now looking at a disruption of supply of meat, especially beef. Because the meat plant workers don't want to go to work. They're afraid of going to work and getting the virus. And we've seen Trump coming out and trying to mandate them to go back to work, but they're not doing it. The result is that they're having to cull cattle and other animals and basically destroy them. So from a production perspective, obviously automation may have to be the way forward, which is not good for the workspace and for the workers. But if you want to be more, as we say, future-proof in terms of future crises like these, it's hard to get around the idea of automation. From a production point of view, I mean, there's a lot of talk about supply chains being disrupted, meaning that most companies and most countries will be looking at more local distribution models and more local production models at the detriment of globalization. And of course, for a country like Singapore, that's not really a sustainable way forward when it comes to food supply, because you don't have the space to do it.
Yeah.
But to some degree, we have seen that in the US. That's been a trend that city agriculture has actually moved forward, and that's become quite popular.
Yeah.
So to some degree, there is the option of that happening in countries like Singapore as well, city-states like Singapore. And you might see that starting to sprawl a bit more now as we go forward.
Yep.
And a lot of that is technology-driven as well, because these little producers typically use a lot of technology to not only to grow their vegetables and whatever they grow, but certainly also to distribute and sell it. So that's where technology plays a part as well.
The third pillar, of course, is education. And we're all seeing that is starting to change for sure. What's the role, Anand, that you potentially see of technology to make education much more inclusive?
So I think this is a great opportunity and a huge disruption just waiting to happen. Right? So on one hand, because of technology, and if the government and if the infrastructure were to be up across the country broadly, then I think your access to education depends on your broadband rather than any other means of, a lot of other things that were important kind of become irrelevant right now. So this is really a good leveler for a whole bunch of people who probably would not have had access to the kinds of education that could be possible because of this whole ability to deliver content online and absorb content online. So this is really, I think, going to be a big change for a country like India, where I do believe that schools and other things are already starting to use video calls like Zoom and others, and we have shown that it's quite effective. On the other side, now, if you're a college and you're running a university and you've spent a lot of money in building out all the real estate, you have hostels, dorms, and large classrooms, what does it mean to really run that kind of stuff? And is it possible to do research in a distributed way? And how do you publish papers? And how do you do biology? So these are all going to become very critical questions. I do see that a lot of the universities will start to do mixed models. So they will have certain levels of shorter courses and education that they will offer online. And many students may never have to go to college to get a degree in philosophy or economics or whatever else. But for certain kinds of other courses, then they'll have to find new ways to say, how do you improve collaboration? And I see a lot of different kinds of people collaborating at the moment, which I think is an excellent thing. I'm working with a group of people right now where, there's economists, there's sociologists, there's the biologists, and all of them are thinking about how to work together. And I think this is going to make it possible for people to think beyond their lab where they had to go in the morning and do their thing and come back home. But now it's like lab all over the place. So it's work from anywhere, work all the time. I think these two things are changing the way education is going to be forced. The other thing on the sort of the people who are already in jobs or work, right? I think we are also starting to observe that there are a lot of new things that we can learn on our own. We could probably do something different in addition to what we are doing now that we don't have to commute for a couple of hours every day. So there is some extra time that is available. Can we learn new things and maybe do different things as well? So I think this whole hobby, education, entertainment, sort of getting in together into sort of newer business models is going to be very interesting.
So, Klaus, your thoughts on how technology can actually have a positive impact on employment and jobs?
Well, let's start from the beginning and going back to education, because I agree with Anand that if you're looking at the university space, I think they're pretty well suited for online learning already. Most of them have the tools in place, and certainly the students have the means as well, and they can access broadband typically, because they typically in most countries there are there are students with means enough to get online and have the gadgets that they need. As we filter down through the educational system, that's where technology can start to have certainly a good effect on how we prepare the future generations for online collaboration, digital workspace, etc. Because what we see now in Denmark and a lot of other countries is that it's when we come down to the grammar school level that schools and teachers aren't necessarily ready. Yes, they can figure out how to do a Zoom call, but it's not really remote learning in the same way.
I mean, do we see the role of technology such as augmented reality coming into play there? I mean, there could be a lot of things that are not. Well, I wouldn't try that for doctors. No, I wouldn't want to have a doctor who's trained on a computer. But there could be other professions. I mean, if pilots can learn how to fly on a machine, I'm sure there are other jobs that involve engineers and where augmented reality could play a role.
Certainly, the technology can have a role to play there. Unfortunately, at least that's the case in Scandinavian countries. Grammar school teachers aren't the most technology savvy, which means they're not necessarily the best early adopters for how to use this. So there's a little bit of a schism there.
Yeah.
And that's something we have to figure out how we overcome.
So going back to the point you were making around the impact on the workforce.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, I brushed upon it with schools, but you see some of the same things carrying into the workspace today. All these people who've been working from home, yes, we've been able to teleconference and do things like we do today. But it has, I think, highlighted how collaboration platforms are still underutilized, because people aren't really necessarily using them in the way they're designed, and they're not using the capabilities they have for collaborative working. just a thing like, basic collaboration platforms that are not really being used to collaborate on documents or on projects, because people are used to not having to use them because they're on the same site in the same office, and it's easy just to pop in and talk about this or arrange meetings, physical meetings, and then move on from there, where they might even work physically on the same document. That, I think, is something that this crisis has highlighted, how we can actually learn, most of us, to collaborate better online and actually use the tools that are already in place.
On that basis, Anand, you've spent most of your career, leading a company that's actually been very focused on, product engineering of some of these technology products. Yeah. But as an industry as a whole, I mean, what role do you see technology companies playing going forward in assisting with the societal recovery post-COVID?
There are many such things that I think we could be doing where technology has a role to play. So I think the tech product ecosystem that we have been part of, I think I'm expecting it to do really well in the next few years. I think you'll see more purpose-built activities to happen. See, most of the platforms that we have today are fairly general purpose, in the sense, we have this video conference equipment and we are using video conferencing. But what would it mean to do a video conferencing in a telehealth setup or an education setup? Or if you wanted to play games on this, can we play table tennis together? So there is like no shortage of things that people will demand in a model where we are not co-located in the same location. And I think if you look at science and research right now, we have, it's taking us a year and a half to get a vaccine together. We are experimenting with medicines at the moment for treatment, better collaboration and understanding of how we could bring all this data together and really figure out many of these things would be so nice. And the time it takes to get all these things together, I think we are going to be a little bit more. I expect in 5 to 10 years, we'll find a penicillin equivalent for these kinds of viruses. So you stick the virus in from one end and you start to pick out a vaccine in 30 days. So something like that is definitely going to happen. And I see that tech is going to make this possible. So I am very excited, and I would recommend everyone to look at how biology, computer science, the various sort of tech stuff, in addition to economics and sociology, how they'll all come together is going to be the most exciting opportunity that I see. And the collaboration that I see, people's willingness to work with people who are not from the same kind, I think is going to be the most dramatic side effect of this whole, rather nasty situation that we are in.
Any sort of last thoughts that Anand and Klaus, you want to leave us with and leave our viewers with?
Well, I think the small startup space is really one to watch. It always has been, but certainly in the year to come, because that's where a lot of the innovation that will help us through the next wave will come from. And they're the ones who typically have a solution focus. They see a problem out there and they think they have the solution for it, or at least part of the solution. And I think we'll see a lot of interesting stuff coming out of the small startups in the next year. I just hope that we have the framework in place to actually capture these ideas and make the most of them before the next wave.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, I agree with Klaus. I think, but there's an opportunity for the large companies to make their platforms available so that people are building off of infrastructure that is at a better level of granularity. I think there are some of the newer things that we've been talking about will start to get accelerated, such as let's take machine learning or artificial intelligence. I think it's going to get more embedded into things. I see a change in the user experience of how we are consuming things, especially in the way we are doing it right now. So I'm quite excited about the future. In the short term, I worry about let's make sure we are all healthy. We get through this as quickly as possible and with as little damage as possible as a society. And I think one of the other things that is the social and mental and sort of the psychological effects of this, especially on young children and everyone else. I think we don't know. We have never seen something like this happen before. So I think, we're going to see a very different kind of people who are going to be This is going to be something that they're going to remember for the rest of their lives in some form or the other. What is the impact that they've had out of this is going to be very tricky. So I think we are we're going to look at a new world, and I think there will be many opportunities. They'll be all very different from the ones we've had in the past. So I think it is sort of important for each one of us to really look at our own situation and see how we can evolve and morph into places where the new world is aligned to what we want to do, because otherwise what we did in the past may not work in the future anymore.
That is absolutely wonderful. What a great way to end that, Anand. We're used to hearing a lot from you about around digital transformation, automation, all those things. But great to see your perspectives as a leader focused on humanitarian areas. So thank you for that, and thank you, Klaus, for joining us from Denmark. And wish you all stay well, stay safe, and your families as well.